Hello, I'm Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, there's usually two sides to important issues. And regarding the issue of whether the cattle market is systemically broken, and broken to the point where both cattle producers and consumers will be harmed, let's look first at the other side of this issue. Now, the other side wants no structural reforms to the cattle market. They claim the disparity in which cattle producers receive low prices for their cattle and consumers pay superinflated prices for beef is readily explained by supply and demand fundamentals. They say cattle prices are low because there's an oversupply of cattle relative to packing capacity, so packers don't have to compete aggressively for cattle. And they say that strong consumer demand for beef relative to the low supply of beef has driven beef prices skyward, again a function of insufficient packer capacity. And then they tell Congress that the current situation is all cyclical, and this just happens to be the packers' turn to earn record profits. But if everyone just sits tight, they say, it will soon be the producers' turn to be profitable once again. And in congressional testimony, Rabobank said just that. Its researchers said in conjunction with tightening cattle supplies, capacity expansion will come online over the next several years, and new technologies will reduce labor constraints, further shifting margins to the benefit of cattle producers. And Tyson testified that it doesn't set cattle or beef prices, and stated these prices are set by straightforward market forces, namely available supply and consumer demand. And it stated these market forces mean that there are times when the commodity business cycle favors one party over another. So the other side says there's nothing wrong with the cattle market, and therefore Congress should take no action to reform the structure of the U.S. cattle market. Now, if that's true, that there's nothing systemically wrong with the cattle market and it's just a cyclical thing, then it must also be true that the cattle industry over time has been treated well by the cattle market. And based on their business cycle theory, cattle producers over time must have fared as well as packers, experiencing about equal times of losses as profits, depending on the cycle. But that's not true at all. If producers have been treated well by the market over time, and if they've fared as well as the packers over time, then the long-term trajectories of the leading indicators describing the structural health of the cattle industry would be relatively flat. So let's take a look. Those leading structural indicators include the size of the U.S. cattle industry, including the number of its producers and the number of cattle in the U.S. cattle herd. Other leading structural indicators track the marketing opportunities available to cattle producers, including the number of auction yards, feedlots, and packers. Now, none of the trajectories for these leading structural indicators are flat. In fact, over 4 full decades, they are steeply sloping downward trajectories. Now, these decades-long downward sloping trajectories means there's something seriously wrong with the cattle market, and that the problem is neither isolated nor temporary. It's a systemic problem that can't and won't fix itself with natural market forces. And this means that if Congress fails to make substantial structural reforms to the cattle market, then we can predict the future. When we extend the downward trajectories of all these indicators into the future, we can predict that the U.S. cattle industry will continue shrinking at a fast rate, and that the industry will soon reach the point of no return, which our sister hog and poultry industries have already done. Now, the same sad state of affairs is evidenced by the cattle industry's leading economic indicators. These include returns to cow-calf producers, returns to cattle feeders, and the share of the consumer dollar that the marketplace allocates to the live cattle supply chain. Now, each of these 3 economic indicators also have downward sloping trajectories. And again, unless aggressive reforms are instituted, we can predict the future, a future of ever-shrinking profitability for U.S. cattle producers. So you are certain to miss the unfolding crisis simply by burying your head in the sand, and sadly, many members of Congress have. Solutions? We have to restore competition. And Congress can by enacting the American Beef Labeling Act that restores mandatory country of origin labeling for beef, as this will allow U.S. beef to compete with imported beef. Congress can also force the Big Four packers to begin competing for available cattle by forcing them to purchase at least half their cattle from the competitive cash market and banning formula contracts that do not contain a base price. Now, we need your help, and I'll repeat that. We need your help. So please go to www.r-calfusa.com to join with us. With that, have a productive week. Thank you, and goodbye.